IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. As I mentioned last week, we're going through this COVID-19 outbreak, and because of that recording schedules, we're trying to keep them, but it's a little uneven at this point in time. Beg your indulgence. While you are stuck at home, I think one thing that might be interesting to do is maybe check out some of the complete series that we've done. The Kulaba Cartel, Woody Woodpecker, Kewalramani Chronicles. These are limited series that are complete. Might be a good time to check out those. Also want to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life and Paytm Money. And with that, let me get you onto your show and stay safe, everyone.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleague Suyash Desai, and we have a special guest joining us, Nadège Rolland from the US. She's a senior fellow for political and security affairs at NBR, and she's been studying China for a very long time, and she's got a new publication out on China's vision for a new world order, in which he's talking about China's quest for discourse power. But like I said, Ms. Rolland has been working on China for a very long time. She's written one of the best books that I've read on BRI called China's Eurasian Century, Political and Strategic Implications of the Belt and Road Initiative. This was published in 2017. So I want to begin with Belt and Road. But before I go to that, welcome to the podcast, Ms. Rolland.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before I get into any of the other serious stuff, you're in DC. How are things like in DC currently, given the lockdowns that have been happening?
Well, actually, my office is in DC, but I work from home in New Jersey, in Princeton. So We're also in a lockdown, and things go very well. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So stay safe, and hopefully this is a better way to sort of communicate right now.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So let's begin with firstly talking about BRI. And, you've written, even in a congressional testimony that you gave some time back, you spoke about BRI essentially being a component of Chinese grand strategy. Could you sort of outline the argument of how BRI fits into grand strategy for China?
Yes, well, this is the main thesis of my book, arguing that Belt and Road is China's grand strategy because it is a way for the Chinese leadership to mobilize a lot of national resources across a wide array of domains in order to achieve a geostrategic goal. So for me, and based on the research I've done over the years, Belt and Road is not a development program. It's not just about constructing, infrastructure. It's about recreating a new world order, basically. And this is why I call it a grand strategy. It has many different layers. It has several components. By design, in 2013 already, you could see all the different components that go beyond infrastructure through what are called the 5 links, so 5 connectivities that include trade, policy coordination, financial integration, people-to-people exchanges, and all these connectivities, plus the construction of physical infrastructure, are supposed to lead to the creation of a community of common destiny, or now it's called a community of shared future. So you can see that from the start, there's this ambition of creating something that is not just about traveling or enhancing trade, but something like a community around China, basically. So it's a grand strategy in that sense.
I was reading through a paper that you put out, I think about 2 years ago, about a year and a half or so ago, which talked about how the Chinese system has adapted to the pushback to Belt and Road. And one of the points that came out that sort of really struck me when I was reading through that was the fact that, this was very well thought of very early on, and Xi Jinping himself was very hands-on in all of this. You talk about how he personally supervised the planning with a small group of close advisors before he became General Secretary in 2012. Could you talk to us a little bit about how all this came about in the early days?
Yeah, so when I started my research in 2014, 2015, I went to China for some interviews, and what really struck me was that the people I talked to over there all told me that this was his idea. I mean, it was not something that went out of his brain, his own brain, but that he had been advised by a little circle of people. I don't know the names of them. People in China were very discreet about it. But when I dug more into Chinese sources, what I could find was that this idea had been floating for a little while before 2013. And so it's not like it happened right there in 2013. It had been discussed among scholars, among Chinese thinkers and strategists for a few years before that. And I think when Xi Jinping came to power, those memos or projects were put on his desk, and he just, he decided to go for it. When Belt and Road emerged, people referred to a particular paper by Chinese scholar Wang Jisi, who is one of the most prominent Chinese scholars under Hu Jintao, who had this paper called Marching Westward. And he made the point that China needs to revert to the continent, to Eurasia, to counterbalance the American pressure on the naval side, on the maritime side. And many people told me in China that this paper was not the beginning of Belt and Road. It was actually the achievement of a long series of discussions that Chinese scholars and party officials had for a while. And so that was the culminating point of these discussions. But it was not Wang Jisi's idea either. So this is how it came to life.
All right, Suyash?
Ms. Rollo, you have already said and pointed out somewhere that previously it was called as OBOR and then it was changed into BRI. Could you highlight what led to this change?
Right. Well, in Chinese, the name hasn't changed. It's still basically it's the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the continental part, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. So in English language, we have an alphabet, so we can have some acronyms with the letters beginning of each word. In Chinese, it's characters, so you just use one character. And that's why now for a little while it was called One Belt, One Road. The thing is that at the beginning, the papers that were written in Chinese referring to One Belt, One Road as the One Belt, One Road strategy or grand plan or master plan. And after a while, I think the Chinese authorities realized that using that term of strategy would give the impression that it was something nefarious or bad. And so they, around 2015, there were official guidelines for the translators to use the word initiative because that would give the idea that the authorities wanted to convey that Belt and Road was something shared and something open and inclusive instead of being China's scheme or strategy to achieve broader objectives. So it's an interesting shift in vocabulary, and that tells you a lot about why words are so important, because they convey a lot of purpose and a lot of intentions as well. So now everybody calls it the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, but that's because the Chinese authorities have decided to translate it this way.
From the point of view of the actual implementation of BRI, there's been lots of pushback within China and outside China also. I mean, I remember that in 2017, it was New Delhi which issued that statement just before the Belt and Road Forum, which was the sort of first public government sort of statement against BRI, on all sorts of issues, apart from CPEC and sovereignty, but also with regard to financial sustainability, environment, and so on and so forth. And since then, there have been renegotiations done by a number of different countries, whether it was Myanmar, whether it's Maldives reassessing things. How has the Chinese party-state system sort of adapted and adjusted? And what's your takeaway from the 2019 BRI Forum?
The wave of pushback, really, you're right, it started really around the first Belt and Road Forum in May 2017. And then it went up and up in 2018 as well. The most important case of that was with the Sri Lanka Hambantota port. And so people started to realize that maybe maybe Beijing had some intentions that were not exactly what they said they were. So there was a lot of scrutiny around Chinese activities, more criticism about the so-called debt trap diplomacy, or how those huge infrastructure projects would cost a lot of money to weaker countries. A lot of criticism inside of China too, because there were some very prominent intellectuals who wrote open letters to the government saying, China is still a very poor country. Why is it that we spend so much money on other countries' development? And the people who wrote these open letters were put in prison very rapidly. They just disappeared. Then you have a series around 2017, 2018, a series of countries who start to realize that the contracts and the agreements that they signed with China are not very advantageous for their own economies, that the interest rates are quite high, or that the impact on the environment or the local population is going to be problematic. And they start to want to renegotiate the terms of the contracts. So we had a series of countries who turned to Beijing, including Malaysia, Nepal, Myanmar, to try to make sure that their national interests were more broadly respected by Beijing. Some of them managed to renegotiate the terms of the contracts, to have smaller loans or to have smaller projects. Some projects have been put on hold. And what's striking for me is that Beijing has overall been quite flexible in the way they have interacted with those countries' wishes. So it tells you that I think there's a realization that they cannot really force themselves onto these countries, and that these countries also have some leverage to make their voice heard. So this is a good thing. It means that China cannot really do whatever they want everywhere, that the countries still have some room for maneuver, that in some cases Beijing is willing to be more cooperative.
So I'm going to sort of segue from this to the concept of discourse power, because I mean a lot of the pushback has also been built, like you said, after the sort of discourse around the debt trap, and this being extra sort of new China now imposing sort of unequal treaties on countries and things like that. The emergence of this kind of language was also part of this pushback. So in your new project and new assessment, you write about China being much more vocal about its dissatisfaction with the existing international order. Firstly, could you tell us a little bit about, so there's an argument that comes from the West particularly, which is that China, and this is true, that China has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of the so-called liberal international institutional order, or whether you call it the post-war order. What are the exact sources of China's dissatisfaction, and how is it seeking to what are the sort of ways in which it's seeking to sort of put forward its argument? I mean, one way I can see quite straightforward is that it talks about emerging countries, BRICS, and so on and so forth. But what are the other ways? And I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the main problem with the current international order from Beijing's point of view is that it's dominated by the United States. And Beijing sees the US as its arch rival for many reasons. First, because it has this military presence that constrains its strategic space. with its system of alliances in Asia. That's a very important point for Beijing's strategists. They think that there's a C-shaped encirclement around China that really chokes or strangles, that's the words they usually use, strangles their own strategic space. So the military presence, the military alliances is a very important component of what China doesn't like about this order. But more broadly, the Chinese Communist Party is very worried about what is called, peaceful transformation of the political system of China. And what they think Washington is doing is trying to push for this peaceful transformation of the People's Republic and the demise of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's really about survival of the ruling political system, of the ruling party of China. And this really pokes to the heart of its survival, its existence. It's an existential threat. And for a long time, this has been its main worry, that the U.S. were infiltrating China, with those freedom and human rights values that they completely reject, that liberalism would transform the society and would transform the political system. So it really is this fear of political transformation that they, over the years, have seen replicated everywhere. The collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the so-called color revolution in the post-Soviet space, the Jasmine Revolution in the Middle East in 2011. All of this, from Beijing's perspective, is a maneuver from Washington to bring the authoritarian political systems of these countries to their knees. And they think that they're the next on the list. And so having to survive into a liberal international order that promotes liberalism economically, but also politically, that supports the idea of freedom, freedom of trade, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and of course, democracy. This is something that the CCP now believes they cannot coexist with a system like that anymore. And so it's a matter of power, but it's also a matter of ideas. And therefore, as China's own material power is growing, it feels like it now has the right, like a natural right, to exert its own power over this new order that it would like to see emerging. And on the system of ideas that would support this order, it's a little bit more blurry. Obviously, the CCP is not going to promote a liberal order because this is not its own nature. It's not going to support abroad something that it doesn't support at home. But how is it that they're going to be able to sustain some global support for this idea is really complicated. And this is where discourse power comes in. It's a way of framing those ideas in a way that's attractive for the rest of the world, so that it's coming to shape. It's a way for them to present themselves as peaceful, as benevolent, as here to help a world in need. And I think some of these ideas can be very attractive, not necessarily in the advanced industrial democracies, but mostly I think it's really intended to appeal to the developing world. So that's why in my project, based on a systematic research of Chinese sources, really the emerging world, the global South, if you will, is really the priority for Beijing to assert its predominance over this new organization for the world.
All right, Suyash?
Mr. Rolland, you talk in your publication, you talk about an alternative model which Beijing is proposing. And also you talk about a strategic thought that goes behind this model and how Beijing publicizes it. Can you elaborate on this?
So again, I think what we're seeing is the beginning of something. I mean, for a long time, as you said earlier, China was just hunking down and trying to survive within this order. I think for a little while they're still going to continue to do that by trying to shape. Sometimes people think that China just wants the existing system to collapse or to be completely destroyed. I think it's not the case. I think they want to shape it marginally or completely in some cases that are more important to them, but not necessarily to tear it down completely. So you can see it happening in some international institutions where China has been able to shape the institution in a way that's more beneficial. I mean, we have a prominent example of what happened with the World Health Organization, the WHO, recently, that has been really, really careful to toe Beijing's preferences. So in some other instances, it's very, very clear that China has been able to shape the perception and make sure that those institutions do what they want. In other cases, I think the general idea is to recreate something that would resemble somehow the tributary system that has prevailed over East Asia for 25 centuries. So when I say this, people tell me, but nobody would want to become the vassal state that defers to this new imperial China. Of course, nobody wants to become the vassal state. In reality, I think there are many things that are already happening that tell you that this is what China really would like to see emerging. It's a different way of organizing the world. It's not an empire that is organized through direct physical control, through military presence, or to toppling local governments. It's a different way of managing it, more indirect, more malleable, more flexible. I wouldn't use the word soft because I don't think there's a soft edge to it, but not equivalent to anything that we have experienced so far. A way when, on certain domains that are priority for Beijing, countries defer to Beijing and countries do what Beijing prefers. I'm thinking, for example, of the situation in Xinjiang, and where many countries don't criticize China or don't, sanction China for its actions towards its Muslim population in Xinjiang. And that's a way, it's an example of tribute countries or vassal countries, basically, because they're doing what Beijing wants. So it's an emerging idea. It has its problems because really it's about creating a hierarchical order, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be inferior to this big power that will be China. And so the Chinese intellectuals are trying to soften the edges of this idea of a tributary system. It's going to be a long run. It's not like this is going to emerge very rapidly. And I think this is why the importance of the date 2049 is really interesting here, because this is where the China dream is supposed to be realized. So maybe that's by then we will see more of this new organization of the world with Chinese characteristics.
I want to sort of bring this conversation to what's happening at the moment. You mentioned the WHO. And in the last couple of weeks, actually a little bit more than a couple of weeks, but we've seen this sort of narrative contest playing out between not just China and the US, but also in Europe with a lot of, given that the Chinese have been sort of pushing this idea, firstly disputing the origin of this outbreak, and then talking about racism, which I can see why they would talk about that. And then talking about, how China is now becoming an international public health goods provider, the leading nation tackling the outbreak and the pandemic. And then there's this pushback from Europe, which, where, there was a response by an advisor to Emmanuel Macron saying that, Europe's done more than its share. It's sort of the European Union has also supported China. It's just that we didn't tom-tom it.
Yes.
And there's anxiety over there, given what the Serbian president was saying, given what, in Hungary, what's being said. Is that narrative contest and the aggression that's taking place from the Chinese side, where they're sort of being very, very vocal and very, very aggressive to the point where they're even peddling conspiracy theories? Spokespersons are doing that. Is this part of this discourse contest, or is this just, such a deep sense of insecurity of what's to come, given the chances of an economic, problems going forward over the year in China itself, and also the fact that how the world will now react to all of this? Is this insecurity playing out, or is this sort of aggressive shaping of the narrative seeing an opportunity?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think, as you know, I don't want to sound too cliche, but I think with China, it's always multifaceted. And in this case, it's both a sentiment of insecurity and a sentiment of ambition. It's both the crisis and the opportunity. But so you're absolutely right. I think the insecurity stems from the knowledge that, the CCP has not managed well the crisis from the start. Its initial reaction was really messy, and this is why we're here now. And I think they're trying to rewrite the story, to rewrite the present, because they're afraid that people will blame them internally. Because again, think about how the CCP thinks, and it's all about their own survival. And if there are some problems at home, people will blame the party. Then it's about the disastrous consequences for the Chinese economy, which is still one of the most important pillars of the party legitimacy. The problems with potential social unrest. I mean, all of that is part of the insecurity and the fear that the Chinese Communist Party feels now. And so it's trying to reshape the narrative to change the image that or to change the story first, and then projects that story outwards. And what's interesting is that you're right. It has really very rapidly evolved into something much more aggressive that also relays conspiracy theories. I think it's for observers of the Chinese propaganda, it's very interesting to see that now the Chinese propaganda apparatus now uses some of the tactics that were usually used by the Russian, which is more misinformation or disinformation to blur, to sow doubts into the minds of people. So that's the goal for that. But it's also, I think, a window into this ambition that China has to create its own narrative and to portray itself, to present itself to the world, as you said, as the leading nation that tackles the pandemic, as a leader, as a provider of goods. They sent out some medical supplies and sometimes little medical teams to Italy, to other countries in Europe, and I think the Europeans are very right to say we also have sent a lot of help to our friends and partners around the world, but we haven't publicized it as much. So really the main difference here is this huge machinery that helps the Communist Party to project whatever little things they're doing, distorting the narrative, creating stories that they project to the rest of the world through many, many, many different channels, and that show this, it's like a huge PR company, if you want, that show that benevolent and responsible face of China, basically to hide the reality, which is much, much darker than what they want to project to the world, obviously.
Yeah. Suyash?
Ms. Rolland, one last question before we conclude this. Recollecting whatever you have said till now, China's grand strategy, BRI, discourse power, since we are based out of India, we have to ask you this question. Where does India fit in this plan?
I have not followed really China's ambition with India per se. I think China would want India to be part of whatever grand strategy they have for themselves and for the region. I mean, it's such a big power, an important cultural and civilization power as well. But at the same time, it's a regional rival. And as you mentioned before, I think India was one of the first, if not the first country to refuse to endorse Belt and Road for different reasons related to not just to CPEC, but also other concerns. So in the maps and in the discourse itself, India is also part of the Belt and Road countries. In reality, India doesn't want to be part of this. So I think it really creates a sort of conundrum for Beijing. They would really want India to also endorse and be deferent to Beijing. At the same time, India is big and strong and a power in itself, so it's also a rival. So it's there's always that tension going on, obviously, between Beijing and Delhi. So what's interesting to me is to see Beijing's inroads in South Asia, basically a counter-encirclement strategy. You start from, of course, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, maybe Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and you can see also China's inroads into the Indian Ocean, the PLA deployments to Djibouti. I mean, you can see that there's a lot of activity going on here that is meant to offset and to balance the power that India represents. So it's a tricky situation.
All right. With that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for your time and for these insights, Mr. Rolland. And we'd love to have you again on the show sometime in the future. And all the best with the work that you're doing, and stay safe in Jersey.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to be with you in my mind and be with you in Bangalore. That was really nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Suyash. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we, and indeed much of the world, has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan, a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number one and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct for an aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.